December 17th, 1944. 5:30 hours. Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank coughed, sputtered, and died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the hatch, the steel echo cutting through the frozen dark. His driver's voice came up, ragged. The reserve tank is dry. Around them, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's elite Waffen-SS soldiers stood motionless. The spearhead of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, was frozen in place, not by enemy fire, but by emptiness, fuel. The blood of mechanized war. Peiper climbed down, his boots crunching across the Belgian frost. Ahead, through the mist, he could see the outlines of Hansfeld, an abandoned American outpost. Smoke drifted from half-burnt oil drums, coffee still steamed in tin cups, and there, stacked like an offering to the god of war, were rows upon rows of olive-drab jerrycans. 50,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to push his entire column to the Meuse River, enough to reignite Germany's dying hope. Peiper stared at the stockpile in silence. His adjutant pried open one can, sniffed, and grinned. High-octane American fuel. The men shouted, half in disbelief, half in hunger. Engines began to roar again. Steel beasts revived, shaking snow from their armor as though resurrected. But for Peiper, something else stirred a flicker of unease, because the Americans hadn't even tried to destroy it. No demolitions, no mines, no scorched earth signs of retreat. They had simply left it behind, and that was the first whisper of a terrible truth. Germany had built its war machine on precision, control, and the illusion of mastery. But here, on this small Belgian road, Peiper realized he was standing inside a paradox. The enemy could abandon abundance. The Americans could leave behind what Germany would have guarded with entire divisions. In that moment, amid the fumes of foreign fuel, he saw what Berlin refused to see. The war was already lost. 6 months earlier, Albert Speer had warned Hitler. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were collapsing. Allied bombers had reduced production from 175,000 tons a month to barely 5. Every tank that rolled forward now did so on borrowed time. Every offensive depended not on strategy, but on theft. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, had been conceived as a lightning strike to divide the Allies. But the math was fatal before the first shot was fired. The plan required 4.5 million gallons of fuel. Hitler allocated 5 million. Only half ever arrived. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the Schwerpunkt, the decisive thrust, received just 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles. The Meuse was 65 away, and so they marched on hope, deception, and arithmetic that could never balance. As Peiper's engines roared to life on that cold morning, a strange symmetry unfolded. Across the front, American Captain James Rose of the 743rd Tank Battalion scribbled in his unit log, "Received fuel resupply 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week." One officer counted gallons. The other ignored them. That was the difference between empire and industry. By noon, Peiper's men were drunk on momentum. Tigers rolled forward, black smoke rising against pale winter light. The fuel they had captured carried them across the first villages, Billingen, Ligneuville, burning through what had taken America 6 weeks to transport from Texas to Belgium. But that was the illusion. Because this bounty wasn't victory, it was measurement. The Americans could lose 50,000 gallons and never notice. They could burn millions just to deny Germany a single day of advance. For every jerrycan Peiper captured, the Red Ball Express delivered 6,000 more to the front. He had found fuel, yes, but he had also found the scale of his own extinction. In the days to come, Peiper would see fires that burned for miles, American engineers torching depots rather than let Germans take them. 2 million gallons erased in a single explosion, 8 million destroyed in a week. And as each inferno lit the Ardennes sky, one truth became impossible to ignore. America wasn't just fighting with steel and oil, it was fighting with excess. And excess, in industrial warfare, is a weapon more absolute than any gun. Peiper stood among the jerrycans, the fumes thick as incense. and whispered to himself, "They can afford to waste what we would die to protect." The engines rumbled behind him. 50,000 gallons to drive toward a dream already dead. The fuel had resurrected his tanks, but it had also revealed his tomb. Germany's faith in victory during the winter of 1944 was not built on numbers, it was built on belief. Belief in willpower, in the superiority of discipline over decadence, and in the mythology that the German soldier, forged in hardship, could outfight an industrial world. It was the last religion of a collapsing Reich. By late 1944, Germany had ceased to be a nation of factories. It had become a nation of scavengers, stripping wrecks for spare parts, melting church bells into ammunition, feeding a war machine that was already bleeding out. Yet within the walls of Hitler's headquarters, the fantasy endured. That genius and courage could overcome logistics, that spirit could substitute for fuel. Albert Speer had presented the truth in cold arithmetic. Allied bombers had reduced synthetic fuel output by 90%. The hydrogenation plants at Leuna, Politz, and Berlin, once the arteries of the Reich, were now twisted ruins. But when Speer showed Hitler the charts, the Führer waved them aside. "The Americans are soft," he insisted. "They will break before their engines do." It was a theology of denial. Every order that followed bore the same fingerprint: audacity replacing capacity. The Ardennes offensive was not just a military operation, it was a prayer shouted into a storm. To the men in the field, the illusion was palpable. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, one of the most formidable armoured formations Germany had left, was promised victory through speed, but what they were never told was the secret foundation of their mission. It depended on capturing enemy fuel. Their advance would succeed only if the Americans were careless enough to leave their lifeblood behind. That was the doctrine to steal momentum. Peiper understood its insanity, but he obeyed. In the frozen dawn of December 16th, as he prepared to move toward the Meuse, he issued orders that revealed the fragility beneath the iron. Tanks will move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines will shut down during halts exceeding 5 minutes. Capture of American fuel depots is priority 1. In Berlin, this sounded efficient. In the Ardennes, it sounded desperate. Meanwhile, on the other side of the front, the United States Army operated under a different faith entirely, one not of destiny, but of mechanization. The American soldier did not rely on miracle or theft. He relied on a machine that reached from Texas oil fields to Belgian front lines, a supply system that turned geography into an assembly line. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks running day and night, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily. Fuel, food, ammunition, parts, and even newspapers, all moving with the rhythm of industry. For every drop of gasoline a German tanker prayed for, an American driver burned 40 gallons just to deliver more. The difference wasn't bravery, it was civilization. Germany had engineered war as an art, precise, elegant, terrifying. America engineered it as an equation. The result was brutal efficiency. By December 1944, the US was producing 1.8 billion barrels of oil per year. Germany, counting its synthetic output and the remnants of Romanian fields, produced 33 million, less than 2%, and yet the Reich still believed. Hitler's generals convinced themselves that the Allies' wealth was their weakness. "They drown in abundance," said one panzer officer. "We are lean, disciplined, efficient." But efficiency means nothing when the machine itself has run out of oxygen. In the ruins of Europe, the myth of German superiority still flickered, like a candle in the wind. They had the Tiger tanks, the SS divisions, the reputation of invincibility, but behind the mythology was a broken supply chain that depended on horses, carts, and captured fuel. The modern army of 1944 was being dragged by the 19th century. The German soldier was taught to believe that will could replace infrastructure. That order, precision, and sacrifice could compensate for the absence of oil. He was told America's strength was hollow, built on money, not on men. Yet when he stepped into an abandoned U.S. camp, found coffee still warm, rations unopened, and thousands of gallons of gasoline left behind, that illusion shattered. The enemy was not careless. The enemy was indifferent. Peiper's discovery in Hansfeld was more than luck. It was revelation. In every jerrycan lay a message. Your faith cannot power an engine. The Americans didn't guard their fuel because they didn't need to. They produced more in a day than Germany could capture in a campaign. Their waste was wealth, their excess a strategy. The flames of the burning depots were not acts of loss, they were declarations of superiority. We can burn what you would die for, the fires seemed to say. That was the real battle of the Ardennes. Not tanks against tanks, but philosophies against each other. One side worshipped scarcity, the other weaponized abundance. By 1944, war was no longer about generals. It was about systems. Every gallon of gasoline carried within it 1,000 invisible workers, refiners, drivers, engineers, welders, shipbuilders, an entire civilization of industry made mobile. The U.S. could lose a depot and replace it before the next sunrise. Germany could win a battle and still starve before the next offensive. What Peiper and his men didn't yet know was that they were not fighting the American army, they were fighting the American supply chain. And no army in history had ever defeated a logistics system that big. By the time Peiper refueled at Hansfeld, he was already part of a lesson larger than himself, that belief, discipline, and courage crumble before the physics of production. The war had become industrial, mathematical, inevitable. And in that kind of war, there are no heroes, only those who can still afford to move. The contradiction of the Ardennes was born in arrogance, a delusion wrapped in calculation. Germany's generals believed they could force momentum into existence by will alone, that by stealing the enemy's resources, they could make weakness look like strength. It was the purest expression of the Reich's faith in control. If the machine is broken, take someone else's. Operation Wacht am Rhein was conceived not as an act of hope, but of desperation dressed as genius. The plan's success depended entirely on capturing American fuel. In the opening orders to every panzer unit, the phrase, "enemy depots essential to continuation of advance," appeared in bold. Behind the technical language hid a simple truth. Germany no longer had the fuel to fight the kind of war it had invented. They had perfected the blitzkrieg, the mechanized storm. But now, in 1944, the storm had run out of lightning. When Peiper's column moved out on December 16, 1944, it carried the weight of that contradiction in every tank tread. His Kampfgruppe, over 100 armored vehicles and 5,000 men, had enough fuel for 50 miles. The Meuse River was 65 miles away. Every village, every mile, would have to be bought not with courage, but with gasoline stolen from the dead or the fleeing. It was a plan built on subtraction, each success shrinking its own foundation. By dawn, the German offensive was already falling behind schedule. Maps that showed clear highways turned out to be narrow farm roads, frozen and clogged. Tanks designed for the wide plains of Russia now crawled through the forests of Belgium. By noon, Peiper's spearhead was idling in traffic engines, burning the very lifeblood that would soon define their death. At Lanzerath, 18 men of the U.S. 99th Infantry Division's reconnaissance platoon stopped the entire SS column for 10 hours. 10 hours of roaring engines, 10 hours of fuel gone to smoke. When the last American was killed or captured, Peiper realized they had already burned 40% of their supply, and they were not even halfway to the first objective. Still, he pressed on. And then, in the early hours of December 17th, they reached Hansfeld, and the contradiction reached its climax. An abandoned American depot, filled with 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, enough to keep his entire formation moving for another phase of the offensive, enough to make the plan seem rational again. The men cheered. Engines roared to life. For a few hours, Germany's illusion of mastery returned. But even as the tanks refueled, Peiper began to see what his men could not. The depot was a forward supply point, not even a primary facility. The Americans had left it intact because it was insignificant. To them, 50,000 gallons meant nothing. To Germany, it meant survival. That single contrast, what one army abandoned, another worshipped, revealed the real enemy of the Reich. Not the Allied armies, but scale itself. The German machine had always prized precision, control, craftsmanship, the perfection of the small. America had embraced the power of the large, the standardized, the infinite. In 1944, both philosophies met on the same battlefield, and only one could sustain motion. As the German tanks rolled forward, the Americans were already torching their next depots. At Stavelot, 2 million gallons ignited in a wall of flame so high it could be seen for miles. The engineers didn't hesitate, they burned their own lifeblood to deny it to the enemy. To Peiper's men, it looked like madness. To history, it was logic, because America could burn oceans and replace them. Germany couldn't even replace a spark. Each mile forward revealed another contradiction. The further Peiper advanced, the weaker he became. His momentum consumed itself. The faster his Tigers moved, the more fuel they burned, 2.5 gallons per mile for a single tank. Panthers, 1.5 gallons. At this rate, victory was mathematically impossible. Still, orders from Berlin continued. Push to the Meuse, capture Antwerp, divide the Allies. But the true division was already inside Germany itself between fantasy and physics. By December 18th, the contradiction had transformed from strategic to existential. Peiper's tanks burned 67,000 gallons in 3 days, more than he had captured. He was fighting on credit against a nation that printed fuel like currency. To the Americans, fuel was logistics. To the Germans, fuel was theology. And theology cannot move a tank. That is the paradox that broke the myth of German invincibility. The Reich could engineer the most fearsome machines in history, Tigers, Panthers, jet fighters, but it could not keep them running. Precision without production is impotence. At Hansfeld, Peiper had captured motion. At Stavelot, he witnessed its annihilation. The contradiction was complete. When he saw 2 million gallons burning into the sky, he turned to his driver and said quietly, "They can afford to burn what we cannot imagine." For the first time, the man who had led massacres, conquests, and armored assaults understood that this war would not be decided by bravery or brutality or even victory. It would be decided by who could afford to waste. In every war, there comes a moment when tactics die and the machine speaks. For Germany, that moment came in the winter of 1944, when its last armored divisions confronted not an enemy army, but an enemy system. When Peiper's tanks rolled out of Hansfeld with American fuel in their bellies, they were already ghosts, temporary extensions of a machine they could never match. Every drop of gasoline they poured into their engines carried the weight of a civilization that existed to make motion inevitable. The truth was this: the German war machine, elegant and terrifying, had been outproduced, outfueled, and outlasted by an empire of factories. The anatomy of abundance. The United States did not fight the war through improvisation. It fought through design, an industrial blueprint, stretched across oceans. From the oil fields of Texas to the docks of Cherbourg, an invisible chain fed every tank, plane, and rifle. Beneath the waves of the English Channel, Operation Pluto pipeline under the ocean pumped over 1 million gallons of fuel each day from Britain into continental Europe. It was a feat of engineering so vast that German planners refused to believe it was real. Above ground, the Red Ball Express thundered day and night. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers, each consuming 40 gallons a day to deliver thousands more. Most of them were black soldiers, driving through enemy skies and frozen roads so that others could fight. They kept the front alive. They were the arteries of a continent in motion. By December 1944, Allied forces consumed 7.5 million gallons of fuel per day and received 8.2 million. They were gaining reserves while fighting a global war. Germany, meanwhile, was dying on fumes. Synthetic fuel plants, Lohne, Politz, Brooks, had been bombed into twisted skeletons. From April to September 1944, production had fallen from 175,000 tons to 5,000. Aircraft grounded, tanks idle, pilots untrained. The Luftwaffe, the symbol of Hitler's technological faith, was now a museum without fuel, the machine that ate the world. The American war engine had no single face, no ideology, no Führer. It was a decentralized intelligence, railways, pipelines, refineries, and assembly lines, each feeding the other in a self-sustaining loop. Its secret was standardization. Every Sherman tank used the same oil, the same tracks, the same bolts. Every truck could cannibalize another. When one broke, another was born from its carcass. A German mechanic needed ingenuity. An American mechanic needed only a wrench. That difference was fatal, because an army that must improvise every repair cannot advance faster than its mistakes. The American system could. It didn't need perfection. It needed replacement. That was its divinity machines that died only to multiply. Peiper's tanks moved forward through villages that had been mapped, refueled, and abandoned by the same system that had created them. The Americans didn't fight for fuel. They created it. They didn't worship their depots. They could burn them. When Peiper reached Stavelot, he saw it 2.1 million gallons of gasoline stacked across 15 acres, a cathedral of abundance. As his lead vehicles approached, American engineers poured trails of gasoline between the stacks and hurled white phosphorus grenades. The explosion tore the air open. Flames rose 100 feet high. It burned for 3 days. To the Germans, it looked like madness. To the Americans, it was arithmetic. The fire that consumed those 2 million gallons was not tragedy. It was logistics in its purest form. Because what burned that night was less than what had arrived in France that week. Peiper's driver, staring at the inferno, whispered what would become the epitaph of the German war. They can afford to burn oceans. The empire of petroleum. By 1944, the United States controlled 2/3 of the planet's oil production. The East Texas field alone produced more crude than all of occupied Europe combined. American refineries ran 24 hours a day, so efficient that Standard Oil began experimenting with excess, creating new chemicals, simply to use up surplus petroleum. Out of this surplus came innovation. Tetraethyl lead, catalytic cracking, 100-octane aviation fuel. The Luftwaffe's aircraft ran on 87-octane synthetic gasoline. American bombers ran on 100. Even in chemistry, America was outpacing Germany by entire generations. And the irony was merciless. When Peiper's men poured captured American fuel into their Tiger tanks, it was too good the Maybach engines sputtered. Their pistons cracked under octane levels they weren't built to handle. The very fuel that revived them was burning them alive from within. Each gallon was a message. You are obsolete. What Germany called victory, capturing 50,000 gallons, was a rounding error in the American system. That fuel had crossed 6,000 miles in 6 weeks, drilled in Texas, refined in New Jersey, shipped across the Atlantic, piped under the Channel, and trucked to Belgium. That journey represented not luck, but the civilization of scale. America was fighting not a war of men, but a war of infrastructure, the mathematics of impossibility. By December's end, American engineers had destroyed over 8 million gallons of gasoline, rather than let the Germans touch it more than the Wehrmacht had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. In Peiper's own records, the math was cruel. 67,000 gallons burned in 3 days. 55,000 captured. Deficit, 12,000. The Americans were running a surplus always. Their command logs read like industrial ledgers. Fuel received. 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued. 1,623,000. Net gain. 224,000. Even while fighting, their reserves grew. Allied aircraft consumed fuel at a rate that defied logic. P-47 seconds at 300 gallons per hour, B-26 bombers at 200, and still, the supply lines never slowed. In January 1945, the Allies requested 245 million gallons for the next phase of operations. Approval was automatic. Fuel was no longer a resource. It was the language of war itself. Germany could still win battles. But America had already won the equation. Industrial divinity. When Peiper finally ordered his tanks abandoned near L'Église, the engines still gleamed under the frost. Perfect machines, silent, hungry, useless. He had perhaps 1,000 gallons left, enough to flee, not to fight. The Tigers, once gods of the battlefield, had become monuments to futility, masterpieces of craftsmanship undone by mathematics. Across the lines, Patton's Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons simply to pivot north. What would have been impossible for Germany was routine for America, another line in a ledger, another delivery on time. And that was the anatomy of victory. America had industrialized motion itself. Germany had industrialized myth. One built systems, the other built symbols. And when symbols meet systems, they break. Peiper's 50,000 gallons had given him a few more miles, a few more illusions. But when he stood before the burning depots and saw the sky painted in oil fire, he understood. The Americans were not just winning the war, they were redefining what war was. They had turned abundance into a weapon, logistics into theology, waste into power. Germany had mastered destruction. America had mastered replacement. And in that balance, the machine chose its side. By December 19, 1944, the snow in the Ardennes had turned black with soot. Everywhere Peiper's column passed, the air reeked of gasoline and failure. The first euphoria of the captured fuel had long burned away, both literally and metaphorically. His tanks were still powerful, his men still loyal, but their machines were bleeding themselves dry. The offensive that had promised to reach Antwerp was now fighting gravity itself. Each mile forward pulled them deeper into exhaustion, into the absurdity of trying to outpace a civilization that had already outproduced them tenfold. Peiper's orders from Berlin remained unchanged. Reach the Meuse, capture the bridges, divide the Allied front. But in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, reality had rewritten the script. At Stavelot, the German spearhead had arrived too late. What could have been salvation, 2.1 million gallons of fuel, was now an inferno visible from 20 miles away. The Americans had turned fuel into fire, waste into strategy. The flames burned for 3 days, consuming enough gasoline to power Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back twice. He stood on his turret in silence, the reflection of the blaze glinting off his officer's insignia. For the first time in his career, he had no words. They can afford to burn oceans, his driver whispered again, as if confessing to a priest. And that sentence, repeated quietly among the men, was the eulogy of the Wehrmacht's final offensive. In the following days, the German columns pushed through Linville, Trois Ponts, and Stoumont, names that, by then, had lost all meaning. Each engagement cost fuel they did not have. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Panthers, 1.5. By December 20th, over half the vehicles were running on fumes. The contradictions were unbearable. They captured depots and burned through the gasoline in hours. They conquered towns, only to abandon them for lack of movement. Even when Peiper seized a fresh cache, 5,000 gallons here, 8,000 there, it vanished like breath on glass. The Tiger engines devoured their prize faster than any victory could justify. Every mile became a mathematical confession. Every advance, a countdown to stillness. The Americans, watching through intercepted radio traffic, already knew what was happening. General Courtney Hodges issued a single command: destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. The enemy is starving for motion. It was not metaphor, it was diagnosis. By then, the Americans were flying fuel to surrounded troops by air. On December 18th, C-47 transport planes completed 316 sorties, delivering 160,000 gallons to Bastogne alone. They were airlifting abundance. They were fighting gravity with infrastructure. Meanwhile, Peiper's situation had collapsed into arithmetic. 67,000 gallons consumed, 55,000 captured, 0 replacements. He was now operating at a deficit that could not be paid in courage. When his fuel convoy was destroyed by Allied aircraft, his last hope turned to vapor. The order from higher command was merciless: continue with available resources. There were no resources. On December 21st, near La Glaise, Peiper assembled his officers. The cold had become unbearable. The sound of engines idling had long vanished. Only the wind remained. He laid out their position, surrounded, immobile, outnumbered. We have fuel for 20 kilometers, his logistics officer reported. The Meuse is 30. Silence fell. Then, Peiper said the sentence that would mark the end of Germany's faith in its own myth. "Gentlemen, we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation." The men understood. There would be no muse, no breakthrough, no miracle. The Reich had reached the edge of its own mathematics. That night, the tanks were silent. The forests were filled with the metallic groan of metal freezing without purpose. By the morning of December 23rd, the encirclement was complete. American armor, 3rd Armored Division, 82nd Airborne, 30th Infantry closed in from all sides. Together, they had 340,000 gallons allocated for that single day's operations. Peiper had barely 1,000. When the first artillery shells fell, he didn't even attempt to respond. He gave one final order: destroy the vehicles, retreat on foot. 39 Tigers and Panthers, each a monument to German engineering, were blown apart by their own crews. The explosions echoed through the valleys like the death knell of an empire. The snow fell on twisted steel, on the black skeletons of burned engines, on the men marching away from their machines. They had fought not for territory, but for motion itself. And now, motion was gone. The American reports that week read like factory ledgers. December 16, 3.7 million gallons in reserve. December 17, 2,2 millions destroyed. December 18, 1.8 million received. December 24, 4.1 million reserves. For every gallon Germany fought to obtain, America gained 2. And so, Peiper's offensive became a parable, an empire of precision crushed by the weight of abundance. He reached the German lines with 700 men out of 5,000. Behind them lay a trail of burned villages, abandoned Tigers, and frozen corpses. In total, the offensive consumed 2.8 million gallons of fuel. The United States, in the same span, had consumed 267 million. The ratio was absolute. 1 German drop against 100 American. It was not a battle anymore. It was a demonstration. The Americans had proved a new law of war, that victory belongs to the civilization that can afford waste. When Peiper finally wrote of Hansfeld years later, he described it not as triumph, but revelation. Finding that depot was the worst thing that happened to us. It showed us the truth. We thought we'd found salvation, but it was proof we were already dead. Because what he captured that day was not fuel, it was evidence of infinity. He had glimpsed the machine that never ran out. And in that discovery, within those 50,000 gallons, lay the silent collapse of an entire empire. When the smoke of the Ardennes settled, what remained was not merely the wreckage of tanks and soldiers, but the revelation of an equation, a formula written not in ideology, but in oil, steel, and logistics. Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld had exposed more than the weakness of the German army. It had exposed the limits of an entire civilization's belief system. The belief that willpower could outbuild industry, that discipline could outproduce mass, that human courage could substitute for mechanical capacity. The truth was harsher. In the age of industrial warfare, courage is a finite resource. Production is not. Germany entered the Second World War with the illusion that war could be won through precision. Each tank, a masterpiece. Each officer, a craftsman of destruction. The Tiger tank embodied that philosophy. 57 tons of armored perfection, hand-assembled like a cathedral. Every gear fitted by engineers, every bolt milled to exact tolerances. But such beauty is brittle. It demands time, materials, and stability, 3 things Germany no longer possessed. By contrast, America had abandoned craftsmanship for repetition. The Sherman tank, mocked by its enemies as a burning coffin, was not a machine of perfection. It was a machine of availability. For every Tiger that Germany built, the United States produced 16 Shermans. Quantity was not the opposite of quality. It was its evolution. That was the first lesson of Hansfeld, the victory of the scalable over the perfect. The second was deeper, philosophical, the redefinition of war itself. Germany fought war as an act of will. America fought war as an act of administration. One worshipped the commander. The other worshipped the supply chain. A single German division could fight with discipline, valor, and ingenuity, but it could not survive without oil. and the oil was gone, not because of cowardice, but because of production math. America, by 1944, was producing 50% of the world's manufacturing output and 67% of its oil. Every soldier was carried by an invisible army of workers, welders, refiners, chemists, and transport clerks. The German soldier was told he fought for the future of civilization. The American soldier was civilization, an extension of an industrial organism that spanned oceans. This was not a difference of strength, it was a difference of species. The third lesson was spiritual. The myth of the superior race, of the heroic warrior standing above the mechanical world, died in the smoke of burning fuel depots. When German prisoners were captured in late December, they didn't speak about defeat on the battlefield, they spoke about waste. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate," one officer said. "We haven't seen it in 2 years. You burn fuel for light. We die for a liter." The shock was not military, it was existential. How could a decadent nation, derided as soft and materialistic, possess such power? How could luxury itself become strategy? It was the moment when ideology met infrastructure and ideology dissolved. The flames of Stavelot, the abandoned jerrycans of Hansfeld, the trucks of the Red Ball Express, these were not just logistics. They were symbols of a world that had moved beyond scarcity. Germany had built its war on the theology of struggle. America had built its on the mathematics of plenty. And mathematics, in the industrial age, is divine. Field Marshal Keitel would later testify at Nuremberg. "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we could no longer move armies for lack of fuel, while the Americans moved theirs like chess pieces. It was not defeat through combat, it was paralysis through arithmetic." In the final months of the war, German divisions surrendered not because they had been destroyed, but because they had become immobile. Tanks with full ammunition but empty fuel tanks, aircraft intact but grounded forever. The silent apocalypse of a nation that ran out of motion. That is the philosophical heart of Hansfeld. War had evolved beyond bravery. The future belonged to whoever could generate, move, and waste energy without hesitation. The fourth and final lesson is the cruelest of all the moral inversion of progress. The same system that defeated fascism also created a new kind of tyranny, a world where abundance became the weapon. America's strength was not cruelty, but indifference. It could burn fuel by the millions of gallons, not because it needed to, but because it could. That power, born from steel and petroleum, reshaped the post-war world. The same factories that built tanks would build consumer empires. The same pipelines that fed the armies would feed civilization itself. The war was over, but the system remained. The machine that won at Hansfeld never stopped running. Its logic production, consumption, replacement became the heartbeat of the modern world. And hidden beneath the victory was a paradox. The empire that could afford to waste also became addicted to waste. Germany died of scarcity, but America would one day struggle with abundance. Peiper's discovery in 1944 was more than military tragedy. It was a glimpse into humanity's industrial destiny. He had found 50,000 gallons of fuel and thought he had found salvation. Instead, he had found the mirror of civilization itself, the moment when progress becomes its own god and efficiency becomes faith. What began as a battlefield revelation ended as a universal truth that in the modern age, production replaces belief, steel replaces spirit, logistics replaces leadership, abundance replaces morality, and the world never returns. The Ardennes, winter of 1944, and the snow never truly melted. It buried engines, men, and myths alike. But under that white silence, a new sound began to pulse the quiet hum of the industrial age, stretching beyond the battlefield, beyond ideology, beyond all the gods that men had once built to justify their wars. When Peiper's column died in the snow, it did not simply mark the end of an offensive. It marked the moment when war itself changed species. The tank, once a symbol of tactical brilliance, became an equation. The soldier, once a vessel of courage, became a variable in a larger machine, and the true battlefield ceased to be terrain, it became infrastructure. After the war, The United States dismantled its weapons factories and reassembled them as the skeleton of modern civilization. The same refineries that had powered the Sherman tanks began fueling cars that filled American highways. The same logistic networks that had carried millions of gallons of gasoline into Europe now carried consumer goods into every household. The world that had been conquered by the machine was now governed by it. And beneath the comfort of the post-war boom, the echo of Hansfeld lingered, that haunting arithmetic of power and waste. The idea that victory was no longer about who could endure most, but about who could consume most. The Red Ball Express became the template for global trade. The oil fields of Texas became the blueprint for geopolitics, and the burning depots of Stavelot became omens, reminders that the same abundance which wins wars can also burn civilizations from within. In 1984, veterans of both sides met again at La Glaise, where Peiper's Tiger tank still stood frozen, its fuel gauge permanently at zero. Former SS mechanic Karl Wortmann stood beside former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. They looked at the machine together, silent for a moment. Anderson finally asked, "We always wondered why you stopped. We thought it was tactical." Wortmann gave a hollow laugh. "We stopped," he said, "because we were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson nodded. "We never knew you were that short. We had so much, we never thought about it." That exchange, two men standing before an empty tank, contained the entire philosophy of the 20th century. One side fought for every liter, the other forgot fuel even existed. Peiper's name would fade into history, tangled in war crimes and politics. But what endured was his discovery, the sight of infinite supply, the realization that the age of will had ended. Germany had measured war by courage. America had measured it by capacity, and in that calculation, a new law of civilization was born, that the victor is not the bravest, but the most industrial. Every generation since has lived within that equation. The pipelines have only grown longer, the machines have multiplied, the arithmetic of abundance has expanded into everything: production, consumption, conflict, and even peace. The world learned from Hansfeld that fuel is not just power, it is destiny. Today, the Tiger tank at La Glaise remains untouched. Tourists stand before it, unaware that the rusting steel beneath their gaze once defined the limits of human ambition. Its hull is intact, its armor is unbroken. Only the fuel gauge tells the truth, frozen at zero. It sits there like a monument not to defeat, but to revelation. A symbol of the moment when mankind realized it had built something greater than itself. A machine that no longer needed permission to move, a civilization that could drown its enemies in the mathematics of production. The silence around it hums with memory. The echo of engines, the rhythm of supply lines, the ghost of a world that learned the price of motion and the luxury of waste. It hums with the sound of the industrial front, a machine that never sleeps, a civilization still burning oceans. For strategy.